In this last video, we want to play around with slicers a little bit more and show how they can also be used as well in those pivot tables, but in the pivot charts too. So I'm going to our engagement rate pivot table that we just created. I'm going to do this part a little bit different than your text, but it's the same general steps. I'm just going to use this example instead. I think it's a little bit easier to see on this worksheet. So I'm in that engagement rate pivot. And I'm just going to go ahead and select it here. And then I can go to Pivot Table Analyze, and I can go ahead and insert a slicer. So remember, a slicer allows you to filter. It's just another way to filter. So I'm going to insert a slicer, and I can decide which kind of slicer I want. So maybe I want to do it by topic. So remember before we had different topics, right? Business attire, casual attire, and so on. So by inserting that, I'll be able to filter my data based on the topic. And I'm just gonna, again, resize this and just kind of move it out of the way a little bit. And you can select just one of them, or you can go ahead and select multiple of them, right? If I click this checkbox here, I can select more than one. And you can see that the numbers on the left are changing as I keep selecting them, right? So let's say I just want to focus on business attire. I do see the numbers changing here in my pivot. If I go to my dashboard, I did complete the work in this section. So I just created this other pivot off screen. So this is one of the ones I have you do in your book. So I created this pivot table already, and I already moved my, what do you call it? My chart here to the dashboard, but it will change as well. So you can see that change here. So I'm actually just going to copy this for a second. And come back here. And copy my chart in. And you can just see how it changes, right? See how that chart is moving as we apply the different slicers. So it does update in the chart as well as the table, which I think is pretty interesting, right? That you can see how everything changes based on when I select or deselect different categories. So our table will update, but our chart will also update in the same way. So that is really helpful. And I just wanted to bring it all on one sheet to make it a little bit easier to see. Again, this is a pivot table that I created off screen. So I didn't do this on screen with you guys, but it is part of your text. But it doesn't matter which pivot table example I'm using here. I'm just showing you how to insert that slicer, right? So when we do it, we insert the slicer on the pivot table. So when we go to Pivot Table Analyze, we insert the slicer there. But that filtering also affects the chart then. So it does affect it in multiple places there. Now you can also apply a slicer to more than one pivot table as well. So if I go back to my dashboard here, I actually do have quite a few different charts and pivot tables that I have incorporated over the videos. Some of this I never quite filled in, but you guys can get the idea. So let's say I want to select a table. Again, I'm just going to select this one. I'm going to go ahead and insert that slicer, and I'm going to just do the topic slicer here. And just kind of just make this a little smaller and just tuck it off to the left for right now. So we can insert that slicer. And again, you can see how the information changes on that particular table, right? But it's just changing on that one table. It's not affecting all the other ones. So you can insert slicers into just one table, or you actually can do it on multiple tables if you want to. So what I would do there if I want to apply it to multiple tables is I would make sure, first of all, the slicer, in this case, it's the topic slicer, is selected. And then in the slicer group, you'll see up top you have slicer. There's one thing here that says report connections. And I can go ahead and click that, and I can see where I've applied the slicer. So I've applied it to the engagement pivot on the dashboard. And you can see that right here, right? So that's where that pivot is right now being applied. But if I wanted to, I could apply it to others as well. So I can apply it to maybe engagement grades. I can apply it to my total post. etc. So I could click OK, and then that slicer would be applied in more than one area. And now you can see how there's multiple of them updating, not just one. So again, if you want to, you can apply a slicer to the same slicer to more than one of your pivot tables, which again can make life really easy, particularly if you want to analyze all those pivot tables in the same way. So for instance, here we want to break it down by topic and maybe try to see the patterns there. The last kind of slicer I do want to show you is a timeline slicer, which obviously has to do with dates as well. I'm actually just going to go back to my other sheet because this one is that other one was a little busy. So here I do have that topic slicer already engaged, but you can add a timeline slicer. So if I click my table, and again, I go up to analyze here, I can see insert timeline, which is just a slicer, but again, it works with dates, right? So it's a timeline makes it faster and easier to select time periods in order to filter pivot tables, charts, etc. So I can go ahead and insert that. I'm going to go ahead and click date, and then you'll see a date slicer being inserted as well here. So right now, all the months are selected. And if I scroll through, I can choose to deselect and just select some of them at one time, right? I can select just January 2024, and then you can see how the data changed here, right? This is February. I can select a couple months if I want and see how that data is changing. You can, and again, it affects your graph here as well. So now you're just seeing those couple months instead. Right, here is 1 month. Now, the reason why we're not seeing the 1 month on the chart is because of the table, it's because of the chart that I chose. The design feature I chose does not have points. If I chose a chart that had points, right, then you would see that data. But my original line graph I chose does not have points, which is why you're not seeing anything there. If I switch it though, now you can see there's the point for January. There's the data for February, for March, and if I pull my slicer and select a couple months, you'll see those lines start to form. So that's just another slicer I wanted to point out to you guys, again, which can be really helpful when just trying to look at data as well. All right, I've skipped back up to our dashboard worksheet here, again, which is pretty well filled, and I haven't quite done every single piece in the book here, but I've done most of it. And I want to show you one last feature of our pivot tables that we can use, and this idea is called drilling down, is what your book calls it, is when you're trying to actually pull out the data that is in the tables. So for instance, see here, I'm looking at the posts table. That for Instagram, there were 6 posts that got a very good rating. Well, maybe I want to see exactly where this data came from. In a pivot table, what I can do is I could double click that cell. And what happens is a new worksheet will open with those 6 data points. And again, we may have to expand it a little bit so you can read it. But these are the 6 data points that we're pulling here that were part of the very good standard, in this case, for Instagram. So this is called drilling down, and it always creates a new sheet automatically. And you can do that for any of them. So you can have more data here, but I could do it here as well, right? So where are these 26 posts? I could double click them. And again, you may have to, edit this a little bit, but those are your 26 posts here that refer to that particular value in your pivot table. So this is a nice feature as well here. And then of course you could rename these. So if these are important sheets that you really want to focus on, in addition, you could rename these sheets and move them around in your workbook and incorporate those as part of your data or your presentation. And again, you can do this in any of your pivot tables, right? So this one has to do with that percent, what data was used for that percent, and this is the data that is relevant. Now here, it's a lot of data, so maybe not be as helpful in this case, but for some of the smaller numbers, it can be helpful to kind of drill down what actual data is being used to calculate those. And the last thing I need to show you here too, I know I said the last one was the last thing, but this is for real the last thing, is how to refresh your pivot table data. So your pivot tables will not, in general, automatically refresh. So for instance, if I go to my media log and I start editing the data here, my pivot tables will not necessarily refresh that data. You do have to refresh them. So that is something that is important to note here as well. So what I could do is I could select my pivot table. Okay, good. So I have my pivot table selected. I'm going up to pivot table analyze there, and then you can see this refresh feature. And we're able to refresh or refresh all. So you can go ahead and refresh those tables as your data changes. So if you make a lot of updates into your original data or any updates, you would want to come in here and refresh those tables. They will not automatically refresh. So that's one thing to go ahead and just work out and be careful of as you're going and using these features.